I think we may have just solved a big mystery, guys. You might remember Cardano Rumor Rundown number 38 called Why Does Cardano Need COTI? This was back in April. It was obvious then that directed acyclic graphs like in COTI offer tremendous throughput, but it wasn't obvious how that gets integrated into a blockchain like Cardano. I think Charles just gave us a huge hint, and it may mean a gigantic advantage for us. Ready? Let's go. This is another one of those days when we have a huge amount to cover, but I think some of these items are pretty telling as to Cardano's grand strategy to become the blockchain. Still, we're going to have to move along at a pretty good clip. We're going to talk about the results of the Cardano Africa Tour, Ouroboros and the Turing Prize, input endorsers, DAGs, Mithril, and the PAB. This was Charles' first video since his return back from Africa, and he gave us a good review of exactly what the results were, both the good and the bad. He said he had a great time in Zanzibar. World Mobile, we've talked many times about their project there. World Mobile has the right people, the right political connections, the right resources, and the will to make significant progress in Zanzibar. He says they're putting together a great game plan there. In Burundi, he said it was more like virgin territory. Burundi wants a national ID system and a national census for their 12 million people. There's a lot of appetite also to improve the financial infrastructure there. However, only 2.6% are connected and only 11% are electrified. Obviously, this is a perfect use case for something like World Mobile. World Mobile can come in, connect the unconnected, and then Cardano can build out this digital identity piece for the national ID system and the national census. And then whatever follow-on stuff they can make happen with the financial infrastructure build out. Ethiopia, I think everybody who's been looking at all at world headlines knows that there was a lot going on in Ethiopia at exactly the time when IOHK was there. Charles says Ethiopia was a great disappointment. It's a humanitarian crisis. Um, I don't know any other way to put it. I think that sums it up. There's a humanitarian crisis happening in Ethiopia, and of course, anything having to do with building out additional blockchain projects is probably going to be on the back burner. He said that the project with the Ministry of Education, though, is very resilient and it's continuing on just as expected. One of the beautiful things about a Cardano-based blockchain nation-state project is that no matter what's going on in the nation-state, the blockchain is going to keep doing its thing. And that's part of the resilience of this whole blockchain thing we're all involved with. In Kenya, Charles says they met with a lot of MFIs. Those are microfinance institutions. And they talked about how to build credit reputation a lot. He says there's a great demand there and great partners like Possessia, who we've talked about in the past on this channel. Then Charles talked about Egypt. He said Egypt was a little bit of a luxury. I think, part of visiting Egypt was, because it's probably very cool to visit Egypt. However, Charles said they did encounter the challenges of hyper-urbanization there. And he mentioned this hyper-urbanization quite a few times, talked about the population growth in Egypt and how it's very concentrated along the Nile. I think this is interesting. I think the idea of a blockchain like Cardano, thinking about hyper-urbanization and how blockchains can help with that is probably a good idea because I don't think the world is seeing less urbanization. So I like the idea that maybe this trip to Egypt planted some seeds in the minds of the IOHK people about this urbanization trend the world is obviously going to continue undergoing. On to Ouroboros. Charles said the security of Ouroboros is unimpeachable, just like Bitcoin. I thought this was kind of an interesting statement because regardless of anything that the critics of Cardano or any other blockchain can possibly say, one thing that's true is that we haven't had to do some of these things that other Gen 3 blockchain competitors have had to do, like turn our blockchain off and on, or suffer some kind of fatal security threat that requires everything to be reset. Charles said because they took their time building out Ouroboros and the security of Ouroboros is unimpeachable, there won't be any hidden flaws or sudden reversibility. I thought his mention of the lack of reversibility here was really important. We all kind of know that Cardano is the spiritual and technical successor of Bitcoin in that Bitcoin is a UTXO coin and Cardano adds onto that UTXO basis with extended unspent transaction output, adding in this huge Gen 3 programmability that Bitcoin has never had. And Bitcoin, despite not ever having that programmability, Bitcoin is still the most highly valued blockchain out there. At the other end of the spectrum, I remember a time when EOS had raised $4 billion in an ICO during the whole ICO madness period. And people told me after that that Cardano would never be able to compete. They'd never be able to compete. Look at how much money EOS raised. That's obviously what the market wants. Then everyone discovered that something, it's been a long time, so I might be messing up the details here, but something like 21 guys could jump on a conference call and reverse the chain in EOS. Everybody was like, wait a second, when we signed up for this whole blockchain thing, one of the things we signed up for was irreversibility, finality. Once something was written to the blockchain ledger, it was there for good. We weren't going to have this thing where the elites could get together and reverse that chain. And it turned out that reversibility may not matter for short term valuations. We can look at the EOS ICO. People threw $4 billion worth of money at EOS because the potential for reversibility that later turned out to be true in that blockchain didn't really matter for their short-term valuations. But it turns out it does matter for long-term valuations. Again, we can look at EOS. Specifically, we can look at where EOS is today and where Bitcoin is today. Bitcoin has none of the programmability of something like an EOS, but it does have this lack of reversibility. Bitcoin's on top, and EOS, you never hear anybody mention EOS these days. Hardly ever. Not in the same context they mention the real main competitors in the Gen 3 blockchain race. In Cardano, this isn't going to happen. We're not going to experience this sudden reversibility. There aren't 21 guys who are going to jump on a conference call and suddenly decide to roll back the chain because something went wrong. This isn't going to happen. Given this very strong foundation, Cardano can now carry out its agenda of achieving things like fast finality, no reliance on external clocks, and acceleration through input endorsers. These are all things that Charles mentioned. I think we should pay special attention to this last one. A member of this channel in the comments yesterday mentioned that they think this is the big advancement that John Woods was sort of subtly talking about in the November mid-month development update we covered. You'll remember from yesterday's video, he's the director of Cardano architecture for IOHK. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this input endorser comment in just a second. Charles also talked about bootstrapping from the Genesis block and sharding if Cardano wants to do it. They can also create very fast permission chains that rely on this foundational root of trust in the base layer. Now that they have this root of trust in the base layer, just like Bitcoin, Ouroboros provides a form of proof of stake that creates the same root of trust in the base layer that Bitcoin has always had. And we all know, in addition to what Bitcoin has, Cardano also has all of the promises of generation 3 of the blockchain, where Bitcoin is only generation 1. Charles, this kind of surprised me a little bit. Charles straight up said that he thinks the authors of the Ouroboros paper will get a Turing Award in the decades to come. We've heard him talk about the Turing Award before. You probably know that's sort of the computer science equivalent of the Nobel Prize, because there is no computer science Nobel Prize. The Turing Award is that in computer science. This is how much confidence Charles has in Cardano. He's not bluffing, guys. He straight up thinks that Cardano will win the Turing Award one day when everything they've built comes to fruition here. He thinks they've laid out such a strong foundation that it's inevitable this thing is going to bloom and flourish and explode so hard that they're going to end up winning a Turing Award. He says he doesn't know if that's he says in the coming decades. So maybe 10, 20 years down the road. But still, this guy's not joking around. He has that much confidence in Cardano. He also talked about how EUTXO is insanely easy to shard since there's no global state and you can bring things easily into L2 or another network. We've talked about this before on this channel many times. I think this is a gigantic understood, if I can create a fake word, understood part of Cardano. People don't yet understand how important this is going to be. One of the big pieces of Ethereum 2.0 was going to be sharding, and now that's sort of been like excised from what they want to label as Ethereum 2.0 because I think they've discovered how very difficult it is to do sharding with global state. Cardano is the exact opposite. There is no notion of global state. We only have local state in an EUTXO system. It's going to be much easier to shard Cardano if they even need it. Or I guess we should say, when they need it. Maybe it's inevitable that sharding will take place just because it's an optimization that can happen. But we're going to talk about something in a second that maybe means that sharding will be less of a priority. Charles also again utilized his analogy of the transition from single core to multi-core processors to the current transition to EUTXO blockchains. He says, hey, the move from single core to multi-core processors was obviously super important in the development of processors, but there was this transition phase when developers would try to run their code on multi-core processors and say, hey, how come it's not running faster? And the answer was that a new coding paradigm was required to understand the kind of parallel processing that would happen with multi-core processors. And the same thing is true of EUTXO in Charles' view. It's the most parallelizable. He contends that EUTXO is by far the most parallelizable type of blockchain architecture, but it's the same transition. Developers are going to have to start coding with an eye towards that more parallelizable structure. If you just try to code for an EUTXO architecture using the same paradigms you would in an account balance system, you're not going to see maximum effect from that. Next, here's where we get into the really interesting part. Charles started describing how every consensus system has a heartbeat. In Bitcoin, it's every 10 minutes. In Ethereum, it's something like 15 to 20 seconds. Obviously, he's talking about the block intervals here. You can either do all of your work at the heartbeat, and here's the interesting part, or you can do what directed acyclic graphs, DAGs, what DAG protocols do, and have a bunch of work done between the heartbeats and then aggregate that work or some representation of that work at the heartbeats, which link them together. Charles says this is essentially the concept of input endorsers that they laid out in 2016 in the Ouroboros paper. It would mean that block size doesn't even matter anymore. And you'll remember, if you go back to that original video, Cardano rumor rundown number 38 called Why Does Cardano Need COTI? And it was kind of obvious at the time that COTI, at least there was some hint, there was enough to form a suspicion that COTI was going to play some kind of special outsized role in the Cardano ecosystem, but I wasn't certain what it was. The one thing we do know about DAGs is that their throughput is pretty astounding compared to blockchains. A DAG has tremendous throughput, and obviously, any competitor in the Gen 3 blockchain race needs throughput. So it was obvious that a DAG might help Gen 3 blockchain increase throughput. We didn't really know how, but I think Charles may be telling us here, hey, we can employ a DAG like COTI to do a bunch of work in between blocks. It can do a whole bunch of processing between blocks and have this gigantic amount of throughput in between blocks. And then at the heartbeats, when the blocks are actually produced, we can aggregate that work, or more likely in the case of Cardano, since we're always talking about representations of work. So cryptographic proofs of work. And this is just me speculating. This isn't anything Charles said. I'm just speculating here. But we can use a DAG and then have cryptographic proofs of the processing done by the DAGs represented in the blocks. Then, because cryptographic proofs can be very small, you don't even need to really worry about the size of the block. It would also help explain some of the focus on Mithril, because Mithril involves these same kinds of cryptographic proofs. And if I'm right, it's probably no coincidence that the next thing Charles talked about was Mithril. He said Galois is doing great work on Mithril, which will mean no matter how much blood the Cardano heartbeat is pushing, we can still just represent that with a tiny cryptographic proof, and everyone can run in light client mode. So think about these two things together, or all these things together, I should say. John Woods told us yesterday they're going to increase block size anyways. But then if what John Woods was hinting at is the same thing that Charles is describing here, and it is the use of a COTI type DAG, probably just COTI, to do a bunch of processing in between blocks, and then use Mithril type cryptographic proofs to represent all that work in the blockchain. You could squeeze a huge amount of throughput into whatever size our blocks end up being. And then if this Galois work on Mithril turns out, everybody will just be using light wallets anyways. So this could be a super dynamic, super high throughput blockchain with throughputs, maybe at the level of DAGs. You can go back and watch we did another follow-up video kind of explaining exactly how DAGs work right after that COTI video. So go back and watch that if you're curious about how DAGs work and the very astounding throughput they can achieve. But if we have all this going on together, everybody using super convenient light wallets that you can trustlessly use and count on them having the same security as a full wallet, and a DAG is doing all this work in between blocks, and that's cryptographically represented in the blocks. This could be the most dynamic blockchain the crypto space has ever seen. So I don't want to oversell that because it's all just baseless speculation on my part again, but it sounds very promising to me. Charles also said next year we'll have 3 hard fork combinator events, February, June, and October. They'll add in big things like new ledger rules, accommodations for Hydra and Voltaire, and infrastructure for sidechains. Charles said this is going to be a period of exponential growth with different trends manifesting this exponential growth in community, transaction volume, demand, and democracy. On the subject of democracy, he mentioned a pretty amazing stat. 24 months ago, there was $0 in the Catalyst treasury. Now there's 1.4 billion. Charles also said, on a more philosophical note, this whole notion of value is up for grabs. He asked, why would you care about ADA's value in fiat currency when the fiat system is so broken with 20% real inflation, which he says is the real inflation number, while the 6.2 whatever percent CPI number is a straight lie. He says money in our ecosystem like JED will be more valuable than fiat since it can't just be inflated away and manipulated. On the Plutus application backend timeline, he said there are 4 different ways to run the Plutus application backend. Have Daedalus run everything on the client side, have a hosted PAB run with Daedalus connected, a hosted PAB with a light wallet connected, or number 4, a light wallet with an in-browser PAB experience. He said it sounds like number 1. He said number 1 is the closest, number 4 is the furthest away. He says that number 1, that's Daedalus running everything on the client side, will happen with SIP 13, which will be in this November-December time period. But he said this is all open source, so some developers may front run this, take the PAB specs, and just go ahead and start pushing out product that meets those specs. I have no idea if I'm right about my near baseless speculation. This idea that Cardano might be thinking of having the COTI DAG run in between blocks and then have cryptographic proofs of that processing incorporated into the Cardano blocks. I don't know if that's correct or not, but if it is, this could be one of those things that creates such a revolutionary jump forward for Cardano that the rest of the competitors can't even catch up. I mean, this could be the answer to Gen 3 blockchain throughput in this era. And it does feel like if something like that is the answer, it seems like Cardano would have the team that would come up with that. They would be the ones that would be pushing those theoretical limits of how fast a blockchain could be, combining this proof of stake chain with a DAG. This is the kind of thing that Cardano would do. And if that's the case, I mean, I've said it before, but it really feels like Cardano could be at that moment, that time when few people saw how much further ahead Tesla would be. And it only manifests when everybody can see it years later, and all of a sudden a Tesla is worth more than Ford or GM or any of those types of automakers. This is exciting. I thought I was excited for the PAB to come out, but if this is something that could be happening in the next couple of years, this is maybe even more exciting. Talk to you tomorrow.